first of all, thanks so much to you, Xander, and to the Southwest Fire Science Consortium for providing me an opportunity to share some of the research I've been up to over the last 5 years or so. And then, of course, thanks everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate you giving me your attention, and hopefully you'll get something useful out of the presentation we're going to talk about today. So specifically, the point of this presentation is to look at some of the interactions between a series of disturbance events that have happened on an individual mountain range in southeastern Arizona. But before I get too far into those individual interactions, I want to take it out a little bit. Oh, Xander, I've lost control to advance slides.
Okay. Hang on one second. Try that again.
No. Oh, there we go. All right. So I have control of the slides again, so thank you very much. Yeah, so specifically I want to kind of take it out a little bit and look at some of the other changes to western forests in general before I really hone in on the Pinaleño Mountains in southeast Arizona. So as you're all quite familiar with, fire size and severity are major issues in the southwest of the United States. Specifically in New Mexico, in Arizona, and California, we've had some record-breaking huge fires just in the last 5 years. And with that, we've also seen an increase in fire severity in several of these situations. Going back a little bit further, maybe in the last 15 years or so, we've seen some unprecedented increases in the size and severity of bark beetle outbreaks as well. Whether we're talking about spruce beetle up in Alaska or out in Colorado or Idaho, or we're talking about mountain pine beetle, specifically up in British Columbia, and then also all down the Rocky Mountains. We've seen some major changes here as well. And some of that seems to be related to changes in forest structure and vegetation. And that's something that, as forest managers, a lot of people have been looking at over the last, say, nearly century, as they see changes to the structure of forests and changes to the species mixes that seem to be driven, for the most part, by changes to fire regimes. So we know that all of these systems interact with one another, and they're complex interactions, and they can be pretty difficult to predict. So now if we take that general idea of these changes happening in western forests in general and hone in on a specific location, what I'm going to show you down here is in the kind of the green circle area that I've just pointed at. That is the Pinaleño Mountains. And one of the nice things about this system is that it is vertically distributed, where we actually have desert shrub at the very base going all the way up to a spruce fir forest at the top, which means that we can cover most of the major inland dry forest species covering all the western United States. So what you're seeing on the left there is a picture of that, where you see all these species represented in a single mountain range. So for this specific study, we're going to focus on the area above about 2,000 meters in elevation. So we're going to talk about ponderosa pine, dry mixed conifer, mesic mixed conifer, and the spruce fir forest type. So looking more closely at just the Pinaleño Mountains, what you'll see here is the vertical distribution of forest types. And the colored area here you're seeing here is just the area above about 7,000 feet of elevation. And that's our study area here. And I want to just draw your attention also to the middle here, and where I just put that arrow. That is what remains, according to Landfire anyway, of the spruce fir forest in the Pinaleño Mountains. And that's current to about 2011. So what that tells us is, first of all, that's a very small area, and it was much bigger. And so I'm going to tell you why that is. Going back to the mid-1990s, there were a series of studies looking at changes to species dynamics, but also really honing in on the fire history of this mountain range. And one of the first things that came out of this paper back in 1995 was that with the cessation of fire right around the 1880s, it looked like there were some major changes within the dry mixed conifer forest and mesic mixed conifer forest areas that might allow fire to spread from lower elevation all the way to the upper elevation forests, where it looked like that probably wasn't happening very much beforehand. And so it was kind of a red flag going up saying, hey, something has changed here. We need to pay attention to this system. And what unfortunately happened was the following year, in 1996, the Clark Peak fire broke out. And sure enough, it did burn parts of the ponderosa pine, mesic, and dry mixed conifer forest, but it really kind of stopped right at that spruce fir zone. That's what you're seeing right here. But in that same year, we also had an outbreak of Nepidia janetae, which is a defoliating insect, just in the spruce fir zone. So in those highest elevation sites, we had a caterpillar eating the needles off spruce and fir. Shortly thereafter, in 1999, spruce aphid was introduced to this system and also started causing some damage. And then right around 1998 was the first evidence people had of a spruce beetle outbreak happening. So we have this compounded insect disturbances taking off in about 2008, lasting from 2008 till about 2002, when that spruce beetle outbreak subsided a little bit. But as soon as that spruce beetle outbreak subsided, we were followed by the 2004 nettle complex fire. Now this was the largest, most severe wildfire that we knew about in the Pinaleño Mountains. So in 100 years of records, we'd never seen anything this big or this destructive. And so what it did is it left a lot of the forest managers and the scientists who had an opportunity to study this mountain range scratching their heads, trying to figure out, well, is this an unprecedented series of events, or is this just kind of a repeated thing that's been happening in the history of this system? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is fire within this system, and we're looking at divergence from historical precedent. So to do that, what we want to do is really just try to characterize current fire behavior and what we've seen at these last series of well-documented fire events, and then take it back in time, as far back as we can go, to try and get a sense of, are we still in kind of that natural range of variability, or we moved into some kind of a new paradigm here? So to make some tests and try and figure out what's been happening, we're going to be looking at frequency, severity, spatial extents, and then also the climate associations of fire, both historically and with much more recent events. So to do that, and actually also to look at spruce beetle and other changes within the forest system here, we had to do a pretty extensive sampling network. And so the University of Arizona, as well as the U.S. Forest Service, collaborated to put in this whole series of demography plots. And so what you're seeing here is basically a grid that is separated 1 kilometer apart, and these demography plots basically cover all of the easily accessible, or not even easily, really just the accessible area above 7,000 feet of elevation. So that's all those green dots that you're looking at right there. So that's our demography data. That tells us the structure, the species, and ages of all the forest types that we could sample. In just the top of the mountain range, so in this larger black polygon that you see here, and I'll just really highlight this so you really get a sense of what I'm talking about. So just this top area here, that is the extent of the spruce fir forest, or at least the extent of living spruce on the mountain range as of 2008. So that lets us know that that's where a lot of the action was happening for the spruce fir. So within that area, we put in these other areas, these supplemental plots, which allowed us to increase the resolution sampling there. And then lastly, you'll see a whole series of fire recording sites that we also looked at. So we did a lot of sampling. We've got about 2,500 pieces of wood collected off the landscape. That ended up giving us over 1,800 pith dates, so basically tree establishment dates within about 5 years or so. And we also got a whole series of fire scarred samples that we were also able to work with. And with those fire history samples that we looked at, in order to do our fire history study, we looked at not only fire scars, but we looked at cohort establishment right after a fire. And we also looked at specific death dates, because we do know that, of course, fire is a mortality agent in this forest as well. So what we did is we spatially standardized our fire history samples to a 1 kilometer grid across the entire sample area. And then using our demography data, we basically subtracted all the trees that weren't on this landscape prior to 1870. We wanted to see what the original forest types were before fire suppression really took hold in this system. And let me just backtrack a little bit too. We know that right around the 1880s is when the original interruption of fire happened on this mountain range. And we think a lot of that had to do with grazing pressures on the mountain, but also eventually in the mid 19th century or mid 1885 or so is when the onset of some limited logging also came on. So that also interrupted some of the fire in the system. So just going back to that, in 1870 forest types, you can see that on the very edges of the mountain range we have ponderosa pine, As you move up more into the central part of the range, and especially on those south-facing aspects, that's our dry mixed conifer. And that's interspersed on the higher elevations with mesic mixed conifer, and in that really pink area, that's our much more mesic sites that tended to be dominated by spruce and fir. So when we're looking at our fire size classifications, when I'm going to be talking about that in the future, when I say landscape scale fires, we're talking fires that burn more than half of the site. So basically, possibly from one end of the mountain range all the way to the other. When I talk about spreading fires, those are fires that burned anywhere from 11 to 49% of sites. And then small fires only affected maybe 2 or 3 sites at a time. So looking just at the fire history of the mountain here, the most conspicuous thing I want to draw your attention to is the lack of fire. In this area here, I've just drawn an arrow. So that is our spruce fir zone. We don't have fire being recorded there. And in fact, what we do see right here is this is the 1685 fire. So this is the last stand replacing fire that we know about prior to 2004. And that stand replacing fire in 1685 is kind of the restart point for the whole spruce fir forest type. And there is some evidence for that also in other areas where we see it was probably also burning with high severity at those locations. And if I bring your attention over here to this little graph showing a cohort establishing, here we have no evidence of trees recruiting prior to 1685 because they were wiped out with the fire, but then we get this major pulse of recruitment shortly thereafter. So that's one of those multi-lines of evidence to let us know that we've got a stand replacing fire here. I also, just before I move on from this figure, I want to show you the landscape scale fires and the spreading fires. So looking at the top of the graph here, these are all the fire events, and you'll notice that they're all prior to about 1860. 1863, in fact, was the last of these landscape scale fires that were burning more than 50% of the landscape. You see, after 1863, those big fires really just drop off precipitously. So I wanted to look at changes to the median fire interval, so how frequently fire was burning on this landscape. So if we start by looking at this lower section here, with the mean fire interval from 1640 to 1880, that gives you just a visual representation showing that it's those dry mixed conifer sites that were, and the ponderosa pine that were burning with very high frequency. If you look at the far right, the gradient here of mean fire interval is 5 to 7 years in a lot of those areas. So from a comparison standpoint, if I bring your eyes back up to the upper left here, looking at this table, what we see is that almost 3/4 of this landscape prior to 1880 was burning at a fire interval of less than 17 years. If you move that forward ahead to 1881 to 2008, we don't have anything on this mountain range that has a fire interval that frequent. And in fact, if we look historically, about 5% of this landscape was burning at an interval of more than 50 years. And now, if we look from 1881 to 2008, we're at close to 70% of the landscape burning that way. When we look specifically at fire size, I just really want you to focus on this far, far right column here. It's basically the percent of fire years burning at specific sizes. And so if we look at a single site fire, so these are fires, basically the smallest fires that we were able to record, they're typically less than 100 hectares in size. And they only made up about 4% of the historical fire regime. But if we look at 1881 to 2008, they make up almost half the fire regime. These small fires, anywhere from 100 to 500 hectares, were about 3/4 of the fires. But we also had more than 20% of the landscape historically that was burning at more than 600 hectares, and even 8% burning more than 2,000 hectares. And just as a note too, these hectare sizes are just within our study area. Now we were only able to reconstruct a study area of about 6,800 hectares. So many of these fires that are bigger than 2,000 hectares were probably much bigger than 2,000 hectares. We had to limit our analysis to a specific location. And you'll notice from 1881 to 2008, we don't have any of those large fires anymore on this landscape. When you look at fire severity within the landscape, focusing first on that last stand replacing fire historically in 1685, we see there was a pretty high burn severity area that took up a decent amount of hectares here, decent acreage. And when you look at that down here on the graph in the lower right, specifically over here, what we're seeing is roughly 40% of that fire was burning at high severity in this one event, but then more than half of this fire was still burning at low to moderate severity. So that's really important to think about, is even in this really high severity system that we think took out a lot of the mountain range, or a lot of the top of the mountain in 1685, more than half was still burning as a low severity event. Now, if we kind of average together from 1640 to 1880 and look at how the entire landscape was breaking out in terms of fire severity, well over 60% is considered a low severity fire regime, and really only about 16 to 17% was burning at high severity, and that's the most mesic sites, the spruce fir and parts of the mesic mixed conifer. Now, for comparison, we're looking at fire severities from 1974 up to 2004. So this is basically the era of satellites that allows us to look at how severity is rates most recently. And within our study area, so just limited to the area where we can sample, the Nuttall-Gibson complex and all the fires before it in 1974 were burning at more than 50% high severity. So what we're seeing is a major switch from a system that was dominated by low severity fires, except in extreme years, maybe 1685, when up to 40% of the landscape was high severity, to something that's really dominated by a high severity regime. Looking at fire climate dynamics, we know that fire is highly related to climate in this system. And so what we wanted to look at is just the classical signature here, so spreading fires and landscape scale fires from 1640 to 1880. So just to orient your eye here, we're looking at Palmer Drought Severity Index over here on the left. And this dotted line that you see here, this is the actual year of fire. And when you look at these bars that are dark colored in either of these graphs, these are significant years. So this is when Palmer Drought severity or dryness of the system was significant. Anything that's above the line is wetter than average. Anything that's below the line is drier than average. And what we see is that classic southwestern signature, where if you have a fuel-limited system, it takes 3, sometimes 4 years of wetter than average conditions to build up fuels that allow a fire to happen. And then the actual fire itself is occurring during an extreme drought year. Here we have a significant drought year. When you look at the larger fires that were burning more than half of the landscape, it's the same story, only to a greater extreme. It takes a bigger drought, takes a little bit more time to build up those fuels. And down here, I've also included the El Nino index, which is also looking at drier and wetter conditions using El Nino and La Nina indices. And what we generally find is that fires are happening when you see a switch from relatively wet conditions during an El Nino in the southwest to relatively dry conditions during a La Nina event. Now, I just wanted to carry that forward to 1881 to 2008. First of all, we have fewer fires to look at, so our analysis isn't as strong that way. The first thing you'll notice is that we've lost that need to season our fuels with wet periods prior to the fire. In fact, our fires are really just occurring during persistent drought conditions. And it's not even the start of the drought. It's somewhere in the middle of a drought cycle is where these fires are happening. And when we look at the El Nino-La Nina conditions, once again, we don't see that switch from relatively wet to relatively dry anymore. They are still happening during relatively dry periods, but it doesn't need to have that fuel build up any longer. Looking real quickly at just 2 specific events, because these are our standard placing fires. These are the ones that burned up into the spruce fir forest type. And what we noticed in 1685, this was the most severe drought in more than 400 years. And we think that's a lot of the reason why that fire spread all the way up into the spruce fir forest type. When we look at 2004, we do have persistent drought happening in this forest. We do have persistent drought lasting over a decade in this system, but these similar drought conditions happened several times in the historical record and did not burn into the spruce fir forest. In fact, these conditions happen on average about every 74 years, but did not result in damage to the spruce fir forest in general. So just some take-home messages from this. First of all, more modern fires, we've seen a major increase in severity of these fires in the Pinaleño Mountains, at least within our study area. But the size of fires actually seems to be at least within the historical norm or even smaller than the fires that we're used to. Small fires have been continuous throughout this whole period, but spreading fires have really been lost after 1880. And what's behind that, we think, is some of the conversion of mixed conifer forests from a low to moderate severity fire regime to this high severity fire regime. So a shift in fire behavior in these different forest types. And we've also seen a switch from extreme drought being the cause of large spreading fires to really just persistent drought is what allows fires to occur in the system now. That's kind of a harbinger of what we might expect in the Southwest, because we're expecting longer drought periods also, so it's something that we need to think about as managers. So moving on to the next section here, I want to also talk about the spruce beetle in the system. We know that it's been a really big issue, and it actually killed off about 83% of the mature spruce in this system from 1996, as it turns out. We were able to reconstruct an earlier date up to 2002. But what we wanted to see was, first of all, have the spruce dynamics themselves changed post-1685 fire, and if so, how has that affected the distribution of spruce beetle outbreaks? And then what are some of the environmental conditions that are driving spruce beetle outbreaks in this system? And if we see some of these drivers, are they static through time? Oh, and real quickly also, for this area, we're really just going to study this study only takes place in the area above 9,000 feet, 9,300 feet in elevation. So it's really just the center of the mountain range where that spruce extent is. First of all, we know that spruce beetle outbreaks are influenced by a number of factors. We know that tree size and stand density are important for when a spruce beetle outbreak can occur. Take bigger trees and generally relatively pure stands of spruce and or corkbark fir, at least in the Southwest. We know that oftentimes tree stress is involved. Historically, they talked about pre-disturbance conditions, something like a windstorm or something else to cause damage to the forest that allows the spruce beetle to get established without having to deal with host defenses. And then most recently, there have been 2 papers that have come out talking about antecedent drought, so maybe up to 7 years in advance of an outbreak being some kind of a stressor, a drought stressor on the spruce trees that allows the outbreak to somehow get a foothold within the stand. But we know for sure that the development of spruce beetle is a temperature-dependent system. And we know that, that typically it's a 2-year system. It takes 2 years to go from egg all the way up to larva, pupa, and adult. But back in 1985, Werder and Holston up in Alaska identified some extremely warm conditions that they thought made the insect shift from a 2-year cycle to a 1-year cycle. And then Hansen in 2003 and 2011 really quantified that and was able to find that the insects undergo a 40-day period during their larval development in the early summer. They can actually switch from a 2-year cycle to a 1-year cycle, and we think that also might play into outbreak dynamics. So what we did is, once again, we looked at a multi-proxy approach to reconstructing the outbreaks. Here you see a growth release event happening in 1950. And before that, we have a spruce tree that's extremely suppressed as it's growing. And then here in 1950, we have removal of the canopy from a spruce beetle outbreak, and we have a release happening inside this stand. So for the multi-proxy evidence that we looked at, the smoking gun is, of course, death dates of actual spruce with galleries in the phloem. The problem with that is that because this is such a mesic system, it's so wet that the dead spruce break down very quickly. They'll rot, and so you don't have a long temporal record of dead trees. But we were very fortunate to find a whole series of enclosed wounds from failed attack, and that's what you see here in the lower right. This is a scar from 1974. It's a documented outbreak that we have, and we were able to tabulate these encapsulated scars and compare them to other records to corroborate our other evidence. And then the typical way to reconstruct spruce beetle outbreaks is looking at growth release of surviving trees. So that's those understory trees that are released by the death of their competitors, basically, that are above them. And so what we did is we used written records and aerial surveys from the 1950s and 1990s to help us calibrate our growth release parameters in this system. So the first thing we looked at is the host range of spruce. And you'll notice here on the far right side, the dark blue Those are areas that established immediately after the 1685 fire. And then it took about 150 years for the spruce to reach its maximum extent, where it was still kind of hemmed in by the frequent fire intervals at lower elevations. But then come about 1880 or so, when fire gets taken off the landscape for the most part, what we see is a major expansion of spruce into the mesic mixed conifer forest and eventually all the way into the dry mixed conifer forest type. In fact, we see about a doubling of the area in just about a 40 or a 50-year period. So when we look at the outbreak history of spruce beetle, starting at the top here, we're going to look at the records of failed attack. You can see we have a series of failed attack scars going back all the way to about 1780. That's well corroborated by spruce mortality, but as I mentioned here, we have a sample depth problem. We can only go back to about 1925 with that because our wood tends to rot out. And then down below here, unlike fire, we have a pretty messy signal when we're looking at growth release changes inside tree rings. And so we decided we had to set up a threshold for what was actually a spruce beetle outbreak versus what is some other environmental factor that's causing growth release. And for that, we looked at 25% of sites recording a growth release event. And that actually, we were able to calibrate that really well with the 20th century records. And then we were able to line that up with the death dates and also with failed attack scars to give us much higher confidence that we're actually reconstructing spruce beetle outbreaks. So when we look at the stationarity of the signal, whether it's changed through time or not, the first thing we looked at was the duration of these outbreaks. And we see that prior to 1880, these outbreaks are only lasting about 5 years at a pop. And after 1880, we see the outbreaks have basically doubled. They're up to about 10 years at a time. But if we look at the interval between outbreaks from the time one outbreak ends to the time the next one begins, from the time one outbreak begins to the time the next outbreak begins, we have amazing stationarity in time. We actually have about a 20-year interval going between outbreaks, going all the way back to the 1780s in this system. So we decided to look at a spatial reconstruction and just see how well we were tracking the advance of spruce as it got bigger and spread through different parts of the mountain range. And what we saw, first of all, was that we had excellent tracking of spruce beetle outbreaks really to just where the old spruce exists. And specifically here, the 1866 to 1868 outbreak, we think that is about the maximum range naturally of where spruce should be on this mountain range. And shortly thereafter, fire exclusion allows spruce to spread out and spread into new forest types. So if we look at more just the 20th century record, we see these outbreaks are getting much bigger. And in fact, the severity appears to be increasing as well.
Whoa.
So by 1923, what we see is that's about the, well, actually by 1932, that's about the maximum extent of where spruce gets established. But we know that spruce beetle cannot attack young trees successfully. And so it takes 30 or 40 or sometimes 50 years for those trees to get big enough so that they can sustain an attack. And so here we see 1949 is the first time we see a mountain-wide spruce beetle outbreak. But still, even this one was only 20 to 30% fatal to spruce. And that's you can compare that to the 1996 to 2002 outbreak, similar in size, but with more than 80% mortality. So we wanted to figure out, okay, what's behind this? We know spatially things are changing. We know the distribution of spruce has changed quite a bit, but there's got to be some other drivers going on here. So what we did is we looked at two different locations. We looked at the original spruce sites at the very top of the mountain, these areas over about 3,000 meters or more than 9,000 feet up in elevation. And we were lucky enough to have a RAS station up there. And so what we did is we looked at specifically the summer months to see if we could capture any kind of signal that would show that we've moved from that 2-year life cycle to the 1-year life cycle. So the orange line I've drawn across here is that 15 degrees centigrade threshold that we need to have at least 40 days above those temperatures in order to get an outbreak to, or in order to get a population to shift from a 2-year to a 1-year cycle. So at the top here, we're looking at these high elevation systems. At the bottom, we're looking at the mixed conifer forest. So this is that newly expanded into area. And when you look at the actual outbreak dates, what you see is just before the outbreak dates, we do have at least 30 days, sometimes more than, or sorry, at least 40 days, probably in some cases more like 90 days of temperatures above 15 degrees Celsius on average that would probably allow and facilitate that change from a 2-year to a 1-year life cycle. So it looks like prior to an outbreak, temperature may be a driver, it may have been a driver at least in this most recent outbreak system. But to also take a look at drought in this system, because we know that it's already been identified that drought can be part of this system, we were curious to see if there was a persistent drought before the outbreak began, and we didn't see that. Sorry, you can't see too far before the outbreak begins here, but we don't see a strong signal of preceding drought in the system. But we do have drought during the outbreak, and so we think that might be contributing to things. So to put this in a better context and take it all the way back for as long as we have information, I go back and use the PRISM data from 1896 all the way up to 2008. And the first thing we look at is to see if there are any significant temperature trends that we can see prior to an outbreak. So like in those fire graphs, what you're seeing here is year 0 is the year of outbreak down here. And that goes through all of these. And then on the x-axis here, if you go back 5 years, so this is prior to the outbreak, and this is after the outbreak. So the first thing we notice is we have significantly warm temperatures for sometimes 5 or 6 years prior to these outbreaks. And so we have 6 events that happened between 1896 and 2008 that we're basing this off of. But we also see that once the outbreak begins, we have prolonged periods of drought stress. And up here in the center graph here, I'm looking at Forest Drought Stress Index. This is the Williams et al. 2013 index. That gives us a little more information using vapor pressure deficits and just looking at precipitation itself. So this tells us that these trees were highly stressed, and maybe that's what allowed these outbreaks to continue in the 20th century. And that's also just corroborated by spring precipitation that we see was also in deficit at these times. So what our take-home message here that we see is that outbreak patterns did track the host range. So the spruce beetle was tracking its host. That gives us pretty high confidence that we're just getting those spruce beetle outbreaks. We saw a doubling of spruce extent after we took fire off this landscape. So we know the host itself has been very dynamic on this landscape, and it is reacting to fire exclusion. And we also see that the spruce beetle is taking advantage of that, moving into the mixed conifer forest, and it's also experiencing warmer temperatures and potentially faster growth in those mixed conifer systems. The other thing that we saw here is the outbreak duration more than doubled in the 20th century. And then lastly, just looking at those climate associations, what we saw was that at least for the last 100 years, if we have warm temperatures prior to an outbreak and then a drought following the outbreak has been a consistent pattern throughout, at least since 1896 in this system. So lastly, probably something that's most important from a management perspective is trying to figure out how people play into this. And the idea with here is looking at how fire exclusion causes changes within individual forest types that will allow us to really prioritize where do we need to put our resources in to get the most bang for our buck when it comes to restoration and trying to get the system back into some kind of a resilient state. So within at least the Pinaleño Mountains and much of the inland dry forests of the West, fire is a primary driver of forest species and structure. We know at the highest elevation sites it's a mortality agent, and in the drier forest, the pine-dominated, Doug fir-dominated forest, it's more of a color of seedlings and saplings and has less effect on the overstory canopy for the most part. We know that how these trees actually work is that they seem to be adapted to specific disturbance regimes. And so if we look at the primary species, they tend to be adapted to rapid exploitation of these ephemeral resources. So a fire comes in, frees up all this nitrogen, phosphorus, suddenly all this stuff is available. If there's already adult trees able to drop seeds on top of there, those saplings can use those resources instantly and start to grow. You get this major pulse of recruitment. Now you can compare that to these kind of slower creeping species like white fir and Engelmann spruce and corkbark fir. They tend to come in much more slowly, but they're much better competitors. These are our secondary species that slowly accumulate the limited resources, and they can outcompete those primary species. And so typically people have talked about, well, whatever comes in after the fire, it's going to be there for at least 100 years, right? And that is the case with trees because they're pretty long-lived. But the longer you go without fire, the more your post-fire recruitment no longer resembles what the future forest will look like. So to give this a little bit more of a theoretical background here, I just want to show you this graph and just kind of talk you through it. So what we're looking at here is recruitment of trees. We've got seedling recruitment coming in through time, initial recruitment happening just after a fire event, and then recruitment picks up. We get more and more trees establishing, and then bam, we have another fire comes in, recruitment drops off. Then we have this period of no fire. This is a Weibull median probability interval. So it basically tells the mean fire interval, the time between fires. We get this recruitment pulses coming in for the primary species. Now, when we have the onset of fire exclusion beginning here, well, the same thing's happening for the initial period of the median fire return interval. But then shortly thereafter, we start to see a change in the way these species can recruit because they're not great competitors with one another. And if there aren't a whole bunch of freely available resources out there, they don't compete that well. And so after a short period of time, they kind of reach a recruitment max. And that's when the secondary species start to take over. And we see a switch over to these secondary competition-based species. Now, this is a simplistic idea of what happens to these really fire-dependent species. But we also know that site productivity plays into this. So just the potential for a site to grow certain types of species is also really important. And so to touch on that, we know that, well, there's gradients of productivity within this system. And we're really fortunate to have had a paper just come out in 2013 that gave us a really nice independent indicator of site productivity. And that's something called effective energy and mass transfer. So that's basically, it's an independent index from vegetation, and it's specifically taking into account the temperature, precipitation, the aspect, and the evapotranspiration at any given site. It's continuous across the landscape. And it gives you a solid number you can point to, and a low EEMT value is low productivity. A high EEMT value is a high productivity. And if you look here in Figure C, this is the Pinaleño Mountains. It's as you would expect. As you get down lower elevation, those are low productivity sites. You get to the very top of the mountain up here, that's one of the highest productivity sites. So what we did is we went back and looked at the species that were on the landscape once again in 1870, and we tried to break them out just by EEMT. So independent of fire and other disturbances, where would you find these species based on the productivity of the sites where they are living? And it's kind of as we would have expected. About 40% of the variance we could explain just using EEMT. And what we see here on the left side, our low productivity sites are dominated by ponderosa pine. Moderate productivity sites, these tend to be our dry mixed conifer with ponderosa pine, southwestern white, and Doug fir. And then those highest productivity sites are broken into two classes. We have the mesic mixed conifer, which tends to be Doug fir dominated in this system, and the really high productivity sites are the corkbark fir and Engelmann spruce dominated sites. So when we look at how these have changed through time, we look just at the demographic values. So looking specifically at seedling recruitment per hectare, that's what's over here on the y-axis. And then I want to draw your attention down here to the x-axis, year 0. That is the year that fire exclusion begins on this landscape. And what we've done is we've standardized that for each individual plot. So when that plot starts to deviate from its mean fire return interval, for most of these forest types, this starts anywhere from 1860 up to about 1905, depending on when grazing and other activities happen on the landscape. So when we look just at the pine-dominated sites, these are our lowest productivity sites, we actually have relatively stable species. We have ponderosa pine prior to fire exclusion and ponderosa pine still dominating even after fire exclusion, but with some other species starting to come in. The dry mixed conifer forest is our most dramatic change. In the dry mixed conifer, we're looking at originally ponderosa pine, southwestern white, and Doug fir used to be the main species that you only find in the dry mixed conifer forest here. But then as soon as you take fire off the landscape, it looks a lot like that theoretical graph that we were talking about. We still have those primary species coming in for a while, but pretty soon they get completely dominated by the much more shade-tolerant competition-based species. In this case, it's mostly white fir with some corkbark fir and some Engelmann spruce as well. As we get into more mesic sites, we get our species, once again, are relatively stable. But we do see a change, an increase specifically in white fir shade dominant species, but we also see a major change in the density. We get a lot more trees coming in without fire. But looking at some other sites here, we have fire-sheltered mixed conifer. So these are sites that really didn't have much in the way of fire history to start with. These are sites that were down in valley bottoms or other places that just weren't getting hit with fire very often. And we find that they're surprisingly stable through time, regardless of fire exclusion in this time period. And then lastly, just for comparison, I want to show you also the spruce fir forest. Year 0 is the year 1685 over here. And what we see is nothing like what we saw in these previous fire exclusion graphs where the major increase happening. We have a lot more stability in the spruce fir forest, which you would expect, a high productivity site that did not experience fire very frequently. And so we get much more stability there. So what we would like to do next is try and quantify this. So when we're looking at a way of doing that, first of all, I'm going to talk you through this graph real quickly. What you're looking at is a gradient of productivity from the very top, starting at the low productivity sites, to the very bottom, the highest productivity sites. And then what we've done is we've broken it out by time. So starting with triangles in 1870, squares in 1955, and then these circles with crosses in 1995. And what we're trying to do is figure out how stable are these systems. So if you look at the dispersion of these systems through time, if we have a whole bunch of the same color with different symbols all piled on top of each other, that tells us it's a very stable system. And that's what we see up here, for example, in the ponderosa pine. We have this grouping that doesn't disperse along the productivity gradient and doesn't disperse into the other forest types, basically, is what we're seeing. You can compare that specifically to the dry mixed conifer forest. In the dry mixed conifer forest, we have incredible dispersion. Back in 1870, looked a lot like ponderosa pine. But by the time you get to 1955 or 1995, it's looking much more mesic, looking much more even almost like the spruce fir forest types. So to test that, what we did is we did non-parametric pairwise test of dispersion. And what we see is the only significant results we're getting when it comes to dispersion is from 1870 to 1955, we have a significant change in the middle EEMT sites. So those are our mesic mixed conifer, or sorry, our dry mixed conifer sites. And then also if we look at the entire time interval from 1870 to 1995, once you get, again, we get very significant results. And you may be looking at some of these other numbers for significance that look really small, but because we're doing multiple pairwise tests of comparison, we have to use really strict criteria. So I had to do a Bonferroni correction, so we really can't reject the null hypothesis unless it's below 0.01. And that's why the mid-EMT sites are coming out so strongly here. So what does all this mean? First of all, we see at the highest productivity sites and the lowest productivity sites a lot more stability than in the middle. That's telling us that it's really strong site control. In the lowest productivity sites, there's probably just not enough resources available for those highly competitive species to even get established. It's too dry. Something's going on there so that those species can't get in. In the highest productivity sites, the most competitive species are already there. So those are your sites that continue with or without fire exclusion. They don't seem to care too much. But what we see is the stability is absolutely lowest in those moderate productivity sites. That's the dry mixed conifer and parts of the mesic mixed conifer. And that's where we saw fire control historically. That was the main driver of the species and the structure at those times. And also when you look at stability of structure, well, really only the highest productivity sites maintain the same recruiting through time. All the other forest types show a major increase in recruitment once you take fire, that culling agent off the landscape. So our take-home message there is that fire maintains low stocking in the moderate productivity sites, and this provided an ecological buffer to extreme drought and fire. So it actually, the spacing of those trees and allowing fire happening that frequently really built some resilience into that system. So just real quickly to go over some management implications for what we see here. Currently, it's the dry mixed conifer forest that's the least stable throughout all of these when we look at fire, and also especially when we look at structure and species. And that's due to species encroachment, structural changes, conversion of fire behavior, and we're increasingly seeing more and more vulnerability to drought. But because this is the system that seems to be teetering closest to the edge, this has already been identified, and we actually already have the Coronado National Forest and Craig Wilcox heading up an effort called the Pinaleño Ecosystem Restoration Project. And with that, they're looking at doing thinning and returning fire to this landscape with the goal of easing competition, returning to more open canopy structure to stop the spread of canopy fire, and also returning the fire-selected species to the landscape. So if you look at the lower right-hand corner, this is some of the initial grinding treatments, but you also see a number of marked trees here that are going to come out. And the whole idea here is that we're really creating a forest that is resilient to increased fire and to increased drought, and all these things have been forecasted for this area. Lastly, if you move up in elevation and look just at the spruce fir and the mesic mixed conifer forest type, that's a complicated system. We have a series of threatened and endangered species, including the Mount Graham red squirrel and the Mexican spotted owl in here. We also know that the climate envelope for this system may be shifting. There's already some research showing that although adult trees can survive in this area, seedlings may not be able to establish very well. And that is kind of what was found after the Nettle-Gibson complex in 2004. It's taken 8 to 10 years to finally figure out how to get Engelmann spruce seedlings to establish in the system, and we're just hoping that they can maintain as this drought continues. We also know that based on the evidence of the 1685 fire, historically this area has been hit really hard. And so any of these T&E species that survived the 1685 fire are probably going to do okay with the 2004 fire. We know that the 2004 fire was patchier. It left more areas available for the T&E species to survive. And so basically it tells us that these are tough, endangered species, and they've been through worse. And then finally what we see is restoration of the fuel break in the dry mixed conifer forest, just what I was talking about on the last slide, may be what brings resilience back into the system and keeps that high severity fire from burning back up into the spruce fir forest type. All right, well that's all I have for here. And so I'm going to move on to questions, and we can open it up. I did gloss over a lot of the methods, and so if you have specific questions on methods, feel free to email me at the email address I have right here, and I can fill you in on all the methods we use to make the decisions and do the analysis.
Well, thanks so much, Kit. That's a really impressive collection of data, and I think you did a great job in providing some interpretation and implications of all that data. So we're almost at an hour, so I certainly understand if people have to drop off the webinar, but I think Kit is willing to stick around at least a little while and answer some questions over the phone. We don't have any questions in the chat window yet, so please do speak up and go ahead and ask Kit your questions. And maybe I'll sort of prime the pump here. I was just curious whether the spruce aphid that you mentioned, was that an exotic that entered into the system, or was that an indigenous insect that just happened to go into outbreak mode?
Yeah, so the common name for the spruce aphid is the European spruce aphid. Since then, taxonomists have decided maybe not to call it specifically that because it actually might be all old world spread, but it's certainly not native to North America. And it didn't make it to the Pinaleño Mountains until 1999. It was in the 1940s that it was first discovered in Washington State, and it has been kind of slowly spreading, probably wind-blown and animal-blown, until it made it to Pinaleños.
Thanks. Other questions out there? So Sandra Hare has put in a question, and she asked what your most surprising finding was, or were there findings that you felt challenged the conventional wisdom? Well, yeah, so it's a very good question. Yeah, we found a number of kind of surprising things. First of all, the increase in spruce beetle outbreaks, well, not so much frequency, but the size and severity does really seem to be tied, or at least influenced by the expansion of spruce into mesic mixed conifer and even dry mixed conifer systems. And there have been a number of papers that have come out recently talking about
spruce and fir incursion and expansion throughout the Rocky Mountain system and a lot of areas that never experienced spruce beetle outbreaks, at least historically that we know about. And so one of the things that we're finding now is that both with coming down in elevation, the spruce spreading into those areas, we're probably going to be experiencing bigger and, once again, more severe spruce beetle outbreaks over a huge area that didn't even used to be host to spruce. So that was something that was really surprising out of that system. And then from a fire perspective, there's been a lot of a talk recently about, yeah, fires are getting bigger, but maybe we're just returning to the fire intervals that there were prior to 1880. Maybe there's nothing to be alarmed about here. And what we're seeing, at least in the Pinaleño Mountains, is that while fire size is actually surprisingly small compared to what we've seen historically, definitely there's a trend of increased severity, and we think that's really tied to that legacy of fire suppression. So although it's not a surprise, it really bolsters the argument that we need to get out and restore these landscapes and really tailor them to the specific areas and target which forest types need the most effort kind of right out of the gate.
Great. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Brad Hawks has typed in a question relating to some work done in southwestern Yukon. And I guess that work concluded that white spruce trees were not stressed by drought when the 94 to 2008 spruce bark beetle outbreak. And that work also suggested the outbreak was driven more by climate effects on the beetle population. And I think sort of what you were talking about in terms of speeding up regeneration or generation times, and then indirect effects on host tree and susceptibility. Do you feel? Yeah, go ahead, Kit.
Okay, yeah, so I was just reading through this too. No, so it's really interesting because prior to the 2013 and 2014 papers, the conventional wisdom was that spruce fir forest types are not typically subject to much in the way of drought stress. They tend to occur in areas that have a lot of water. And so conventional wisdom was that spruce beetle outbreaks couldn't be associated with drought situations. As we've gotten better data, especially here in the Southwest, we're able to see that there are other stressors that are part of the system. But I think what's important to think about here is that the spruce fir forest that we've done our reconstruction for, this is the southernmost spruce fir forest in all of North America. So it is absolutely at its range extent. And so if there were a forest that were experiencing drought and temperatures that were uncharacteristic of the past, this is that forest. And so we think that that's one of the reasons why we are picking up a stronger temperature signal. But we also know that all these insect outbreaks tend to be influenced by other climatic factors. And it seems like there's a unique set of characteristics that drives every one of these outbreaks. So what we're trying to do is take a step back, look at as many outbreaks as possible, and pull out some kind of a common signal. And what we found is that our signal, at least in this mountain range, seems to jive both with the temperature signal of changing the insect regeneration time, but also with the drought signal. And prior to that, people hadn't found a temperature signal, and some of the drought evidence seemed to go back many, many years, and which also doesn't seem characteristic of what you'd find in a spruce system, because spruce would be recovering pretty quickly. Typically, if it had 4 or 5 years after a drought, you wouldn't expect it to manifest that and still be vulnerable to spruce beetle outbreak.
Great, very interesting. Other questions out there? Pepe, you don't have a question?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
No, I don't have. Well, I mean, I have I'm not sure I understand it, but one of the things that struck me is that you're saying that there's a lot of instability in the mixed conifer, and to me the mixed conifer what you refer to instability, to me, I kind of view it as more of a flexible vegetation type. So I mean, I was on the Pinaleño just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that struck me was how the mixed conifer is regenerating so vigorously. So it seems to be kind of almost taking advantage of these fires to kind of, I don't know if expand, but I mean, to me it seems like the species within the mixed conifer are more malleable to these conditions, and they might, to me, they might be actually do better than the ponderosa and the spruce fir, which are kind of set in their ways, so to speak.
Yeah, so actually, Pepe, that's exactly the point that we try to really press on with the paper that's coming out of the firework, and that is that when you get fire back into the mixed conifer system, it can become resilient and really reset itself and take advantage of fire once it comes back. Because it's in that medium state. It's in that productivity level that allows something like white fir to go crazy because there's enough moisture and the temperature is good and the nutrients are right to allow invasion by the secondary species. But at the same time, if you get fire back into the system, and especially at regular intervals, you can really return it to a much more open, almost ponderosa pine type structure that would really make it resilient to changing precipitation regimes, so it getting drier, it getting hotter. And what you basically have is you have this buffer of productivity within that system that you're not taking full advantage of. So what you're doing is you're keeping that buffer there that allows the species to persist. Whereas if you look at something like the ponderosa pine system, it's already limited species because it seems like a lot of those invading species that would get in there, or the secondary species I should say, really can't hack it because it's already too low a productivity site. So if we start looking at drier, warmer temperatures happening, it's already a stress site, so it might become even more stressed. And then once again, when we look at the ponderosa, or at the spruce fir system, it's used to having all of the resources it could possibly have. And so as that site changes in its conditions, it also would probably become less stable. So what we basically tried to pull out of this was that if today you have resources to go in and restore a system, you can get a lot more bang for your buck right now in the mixed conifer forest than you can by going either above or below within this system.
Also, so the idea is that there's still time, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, all right, cool, thanks.
So if there aren't any other questions, I think we'll let Kit off the hook. But I want to thank you again, Kit. It was a really excellent presentation, and you did a nice job of compressing a lot of work and a lot of data into an intelligible hour. So I really thank you. And I'll just remind everybody on the call, we'll have another webinar next month, and we do have that slide fire field trip this Friday if you're in the neighborhood, and keep an eye out for the smoke workshop this fall. So thank you all very much, and with that I'll close the webinar.
All right, thank you, Vendor.
Thanks.